Alright guys, this should be a fun one. Today we're going to be talking about resin inclusions, which I guess technically includes anything that you can put in resin, but we're talking specifically about non-colorants. We're talking about larger things that you can put into your resin projects. This is actually the last video in a 3-part video series talking about resin supplies. So if you want to hear about basic resin supplies or resin colorants, you should check out my last 2 videos. So, resin inclusions. The possibilities here are endless. I'm not going to be able to cover every possible thing. I'm sure there's stuff that I've forgotten. So this comes with a little bit of a pre-warning of, please try things, experiment, have fun, do stuff that I don't mention. These are just a few ideas of things that you can use. All right, I'm going to try and break these ideas down into some broad categories of items. First up, let's talk about glitters, flakes, foils, and tinsel. So this broad category probably makes up a majority of the inclusions I use. Foil. One of my favorite things to add to resin is different colors of foil, especially gold. Gold is a classic. Foil is very thin sheets of metal, and it comes in a lot of different colors. It's so light and thin that it breaks apart really easily, and it usually does a pretty good job of staying suspended in the resin. Sometimes it'll sink a little bit, but not a ton. I like how it flakes apart and crinkles up. It adds a lot of texture and a nice variety of different sized particles in the resin, and the metallic nature of it really sparkles. The light really catches it. Mylar flakes. You can get these sorts of flakes of plastic that look kind of similar to the foil, but they don't break apart the same way. I don't like them nearly as much because they will sometimes get caught around the edges of my lids on my dice molds, and then they sand down weird. I do like the iridescent flakes though. I do think that they're really pretty. Mylar. The really thin plastic called Mylar also comes in full sheets or rolls as well. It can be scrunched up to give a really cool effect. It's very easy to get air trapped in the bigger pieces of Mylar, so my suggestions would be to not cut off too big of a piece, and also to possibly dip your sheet of Mylar in the resin before you put it into your mold so that no air bubbles are attached to it when you put it in. Like the smaller flakes, it can sometimes sand down weird if it pushes against the sides of the mold, so that's another reason not to cut off too big of a piece. Mica flakes. In my personal opinion, even better than the Mylar flakes is mica flakes. They are slightly different, so it really depends on the project that you're going for and the look that you're going for. The mica flakes tend to be smaller, but like the metal foils, they will break apart easily. Like the Mylar, they also come in beautiful color shifting colors. They come in iridescent colors, so translucent and color shifting, and multichromatic, which are more opaque and metallic color shifting. They're really pretty. I will definitely leave links to both of these down in the description. Glitter! I don't personally use a ton of just plain old glitter in my projects, but I do definitely still use it some. I know some people absolutely love it. It's just kind of a personal preference thing. It comes in lots of different sizes, including super fine glitter, just your standard glitter, and chunky glitter. It also comes in different shapes, which can be a lot of fun. One of the things with glitter is that it tends to sink a lot, especially the bigger flakes. So you have to wait for the resin to thicken up a bit before pouring if you want the glitter to stay suspended. For that reason, I usually use more fine glitter than anything, but you can do some really pretty stuff with some chunky flakes too and some bigger pieces. Sequins, they're also kind of like glitter, they're just bigger. I don't know if I've ever used any sequins in my dice, but they're definitely an option. And tinsel. I have used tinsel before. I've found that it tends to spiral all in one spot and can be a bit unwieldy when trying to get it go where you want it to go. So if you want to leave it in long strands, it works better in bigger or more 3-dimensional molds where the mold has more surface area for you to push the tinsel against. Our next big overarching category is organics. This is probably my next most used inclusion. By organics, I mean anything that used to be living or pieces of living things. For the most part, this means plants. I often use flowers, moss, leaves, those sorts of things in my resin projects. To get them, I've ordered things online, collected them from my yard, and dried them out myself. And I've gone to local craft and hobby stores. Those are all great places to find things. The main thing with plants is to make sure that your floral inclusions are completely dry before you put them in the resin. Moisture can cause the resin to not cure properly, and the plants may not hold up as well over time if they still have water in them. When working with flowers and plants, I found that they often like to float, so it's good to keep that in mind when coming up with the design that includes them. Air bubbles also tend to get trapped in all the little nooks and crannies of the flowers, so it might be useful to dip your plants in the resin before adding them to the mold to try and keep air bubbles from getting trapped under them. If dipping the plants isn't an option, you might let your mold sit for a little while after pouring the resin. so that you can add more resin to the molds as air bubbles escape and give a chance for air bubbles to escape. Also included in plants are things like whole spices and orange peel, that sort of thing. Those also work really well in resin as long as they're dry. All right, bugs. Bugs behave pretty similarly to plants. They tend to be delicate, they like to try and float, and they have lots of areas that air bubbles can get trapped on them. I've also noticed with bugs that sometimes they'll pull away from the resin around them after a while. I'm not sure if it's because I cure them under pressure or if I haven't properly sealed or prepared them somehow. If you have any ideas, feel free to let me know. Snake shed. Snake skin is also really cool. I got some from a friend at one point from their snake that had shed. But if you or people you know don't have any pet snakes, you can also find shed for sale on Etsy. I just typed in snake shed and it came up with a bunch of options. I found that the skin kind of disappears in my resin when I use it as is, so I will usually dye it with an alcohol ink first. That also means that you can make your snake skin any fun color that you want, which is kind of fun. And then once again, like plants and bugs and the sheets of mylar, it's really easy to get air trapped under it, so you might try dipping it before putting it into the mold. Feathers. Feathers also add a really cool look. I haven't had too much issues with putting them into the molds first before pouring the resin in, but I also haven't tried curing them not in a pressure pot. Ashes. I recently tried putting ashes in resin. They were more like a pigment powder than anything, but it seemed fitting to mention them here while we're talking about organic material. They tended to sink and had very inconsistently sized particles. There were some bigger pieces and some that was very powdery, which did add an interesting texture if that's what you're going for. Fur! I'm well versed in this one. I've done dice filled with animal fur. If you ever stop by one of my streams, chat will let you know that all of my dice come with free cat hair, which, okay, that's kind of fair, but also stop. Stop spreading this vicious rumor. But back when I was streaming on Twitch before I ever did YouTube videos, chat tried to convince me to make a set of dice purposefully full of cat hair. And then they seemed shocked when I just grabbed a bag of cat hair out of the drawer next to me. I did then proceed to make a whole set of dice that were full of cat hair. It's their own fault for suggesting it. The consensus, well, it was a 50-50. The two views on the set of dice afterwards seemed to be half, those are cursed, and half, oh, that'd be nice for a pet memorial piece. I haven't tried sanding the dice yet, but let me go do that and I'll let you know how they do. Yeah, seems like it sands pretty okay. That looks pretty good to me. Before sanding, they have little hairs sticking out around where the lid was, which makes sense, but looks kind of weird. Teeth and bones. Depending on the bones, they might turn slightly transparent in resin. It's been a little while since I've used bones in resin, but if I remember correctly, I think they tended to sink. So if you want them centered, it might be useful to do things in layers or make some sort of support structure, maybe with UV resin or some other inclusion that you can put it on top of. Textiles. By textiles, I mean anything fabric or fibers related. I haven't done a ton with fabric and such, but I've done a little bit and it can be quite fun and pretty. I will say that it doesn't really sand well, so it's good to keep fabric and such away from the edges of the molds. I don't have a ton to say on textiles like this, except that like a lot of other larger inclusions, it might be useful to dip the fabric or whatever you're using in the resin before putting it in the mold. I have tried a few different things like thread, lace, ribbons, and mesh. I haven't tried thicker or bigger pieces of fabric, yarn or wool roving. They're a bit thicker, so I've been worried about air getting trapped more easily, but they could be interesting to try. I definitely want to experiment with textiles a bit more. I haven't used them quite as much, but they make for some very pretty sets of dice. Constructed inclusions. These are inclusions that you are designing and making yourself, or that you're constructing out of multiple pieces. I tend to think of these as some of the most complicated inclusions. I've had a single constructed inclusion take me probably 5 hours to make before. Possibly the simplest, at least in my opinion, is liquid cores. Liquid cores are a very popular inclusion. I have a whole video on how to make them. I'll link that as well. But basically you make spheres that are filled with liquid that have mica and or glitter or other things that you want to swirl around on the inside when you shake it. And then you can also attach things to the outside of the core if you want to. And then you put those into your dice. Dice blanks. Dice blanks are somewhat similar to liquid cores in that you can affix things to them, like nail stickers and charms or paint. Dice blanks are basically smaller dice with no numbers, so you pour them first, then encase those in the actual dice. You need to make sure that your dice blanks just barely touch the numbers in the dice molds. Mine are slightly too big still. I've sanded them down a couple of times and they're still a little bit too big, so they push on the numbers and they bow out the sides a bit, and then it requires extra sanding, which is kind of a pain. Dice blanks are also useful for adding inclusions that might not do well if they are against the sides of the molds, like plants or fabric. 3D printed figures. A UV resin printer can be used to print out dice masters, but you can also use it to print out inclusions. You can find 3D files on places like Thingiverse or some other places online. You can commission people to make them, or you can make them yourself in a 3D modeling software like Blender. I've done a few sets of dice where I printed out some items, painted them with some paint, and popped them right into the molds, and they were ready to go. I'm sure there's some designs too where you wouldn't even need to paint them if you didn't want to. Resin. You can use a UV resin printer to print dice masters, but you can also use it to print other masters, so little things to make molds of, and then pour resin into those molds to make more inclusions. You can also make molds out of other things or buy tiny molds and make resin inclusions in those. I've made and used tiny crystal molds. A friend made me some tiny resin skulls once. You can make some cool stuff this way. Polymer clay. I've used polymer clay a bit to make resin inclusions. It's satisfying to physically sculpt something to go into the resin, but it can also take a while. Depending on what you're making, it might be easier to print or purchase something. As a note, polymer clay also tends to sink in resin, so it's good to keep that in mind. Decorated plastic sheets. You have any old thin plastic packaging lying around? Why not paint it and stick it in your resin? I've used thin pieces of plastic when I want something to look 2D in my resin, like when I did Minecraft flowers or video game characters. Now that I'm thinking about it, I should try putting some stickers on one of those sheets and put that in my dice to see how it looks. That could be cool. Cricut cutouts. I haven't messed around with a Cricut or like a die cutting machine, any of those things, but I know it's fairly popular to make 2D cutouts to put in like resin trays or other flat projects, or even small stickers to attach to blanks and liquid cores. So if you already have access to a Cricut, might as well see what you can make to put in resin. Miscellaneous. There is so many things you can put in resin. I have a ton that I couldn't figure out what category to put in, so here's just a bunch more. Small figurines. Instead of making your own, sometimes you can get pre-made small plastic figures to put in your resin. Seashells. Seashells look really cool. They're quite a bit heavier than resin, so they might weight things if you have a bunch all at one end of like a die, but they should be fine if they're centered or in projects that balance doesn't matter on, like, you know, you make a little beach tray. That'd be pretty. I've done that before. They look really cool though. It's a similar story for wire and chain. They're quite a bit heavier than resin, so they'll sink and cause weighting problems if that's an issue for what you're making. You can solidify chain with UV resin, which is kind of cool, so that'll help keep it in place and you can get some cool shapes and stuff with it. Or you can attach it to some sort of structure like a dice blank or something like that. Paper can sometimes end up a little see-through depending on the paper, but there's cool things you could try with that. Sprinkles. With sprinkles, you want to make sure that you put them into blanks first, because I've found that if they're against the size of the dice, when you start sanding, it sands off part of the sprinkle and then you have sprinkles exposed to air, which isn't good. I've also found that those sprinkles sometimes bleed color. It might be useful to seal them first. Sand, again, is heavy, so, you know, might weight things weird, but it can be pretty cool. Sand does seem to work better if you mix the sand and the resin together first before putting it into the mold. Look, guys, the options here are limitless. There's a ton more random things I've tried and just didn't have space for on the list, like old keys and screws, pieces from other craft kits, beads, buttons, metal charms, gears, nail charms. There's so many. And there's tons of things I haven't tried either, like googly eyes, or I've seen people use puffed up ivory soap. If you didn't know, you can put a bar of ivory soap in the microwave, it puffs up. I've seen people use that for clouds. I've got a bunch of bits of rubber just lying around. I'm like, oh, I should put that in resin at some point, and I haven't gotten around to it. Metal shavings, same deal. Cotton balls, I don't know if those might be, they might do a cool fog effect. I don't know, I haven't tried them. Pencil shavings, dude, it's like, I am very miniature kitchen sinks. You get the idea. Here's the main things to keep in mind when choosing resin inclusions. Some things may weight your projects, so if you're making dice, it's good to pick inclusions with similar densities to the resin, or at least try to center things. If you're working on something that doesn't matter, then pick what you want. The inclusions need to be dry to avoid causing curing problems with your resin, and air can get trapped under inclusions really easily, especially the ones that have a lot of nooks and crannies to them. So it might be useful to pre-dip your inclusions in resin before putting them in the molds. It might also be useful to move the inclusions around a little bit once they're in the molds to break off air bubbles, or let the resin sit in the molds for a bit before putting lids on to let air have time to escape. If there is something that I didn't mention and you want to suggest that I try or that other people try, feel free to leave your inclusion ideas down in the comments. Or if there's something you'd like me to go more in depth on, let me know. For example, I could probably do a whole video talking about adding flowers to resin. Or if you'd be interested in something beyond just these 3 videos of simple resin supplies, like talking about packaging materials or filming supplies and stuff like that, let me know about that too. I do want to go ahead and take the time to thank my lovely patrons for making stuff like this possible. Put the names on the screen. If you want to join, there will be a link in the description. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a 3-part video series, so feel free to go check out the last 2 videos about basic resin supplies and resin colorants. Thanks for hanging out and taking the time to watch. I have some fun projects coming up, so keep an eye out for those. See you guys in the next video. Bye! Bugs behave pretty similarly. So if you want them centered, it might be useful to do things in layers or make some sort of support. That's the word. You have any old plastic packaging around? You have any old thin plastic packaging lying around? I can't talk. I think is that everything? What's my normal outro? I don't remember what my normal outro is. Let me scroll up. Do I have something written down here? Yeah, I think it's good.